Once you've created awesome, meaningful, and appropriate boundaries, you'll explain these boundaries to your volunteers. You'll probably communicate them from the beginning of their engagement, and you should keep reiterating them throughout their involvement. No matter how clear and succinct your boundaries are, volunteers can still break them. It happens, so let's find out why. Volunteers might violate boundaries for a lot of reasons. It could just sneak up on them without them knowing. They might see a perceived need that they want to fill. They might disagree with the values and reasoning behind the boundary. Sometimes, volunteers don't even know they're violating the boundary. You might also find volunteers violate a boundary to fulfill an emotional need, or they've done it before and no one said anything. Or, and this could be a reason for a lot of volunteers, they might be burning out or going through another intense life event. To help determine why volunteers violate and break their boundaries, you should consider the ways volunteers respond to boundaries and rules. When a volunteer breaks a boundary, you're basically asking, why didn't they follow the rules? They didn't know the rules. Maybe the boundary wasn't clearly explained to your volunteers at the beginning, and so they just don't know it's a rule or boundary. They didn't think the boundary mattered, or they didn't know why the boundary existed. Maybe they don't have a full grasp on the reasoning, risks, and ideas behind the boundary, or they just don't think it's important to maintain the boundary for the purpose of their role or interactions. They thought their way was better. Volunteers might see a need that they thought wasn't being fulfilled by your role or program, so they decided to fill that need themselves. We'll talk about this more shortly. They thought the boundary was less important than the results of ignoring it. This is where a volunteer knows about the boundary, but thinks that crossing it is more important than the consequences. This is similar to the notion of asking for forgiveness instead of asking for permission. They didn't believe there would be a negative consequence. Even if you explain the consequences clearly and frequently, the volunteer may not deem them serious enough or think they will actually occur. They didn't recognize the positive results of staying within the boundary. As mentioned in Lesson 1, it's important to talk about positive consequences and results as well. By not breaking the boundary, volunteers might create stronger and more meaningful relationships. In reality, most volunteers tend to violate boundaries because of two core reasons. Volunteers want to be helpful. 93% of volunteers do so because they want to make a difference, according to the most recent General Social Survey on giving, volunteering, and participating. In fact, this is the highest motivation for volunteers in the survey. 60% of volunteers in the same survey state that they are affected by the cause or mandate of your organization. Volunteers want to be as helpful as possible in making a difference and serving your mission. But volunteers also don't want to be helpless. Clients might need additional support, and volunteers can feel powerless or like they failed if they didn't offer help. This can lead to volunteers violating boundaries because they think they're helping the client further. One of the ways to better understand why volunteers violate boundaries is to think about how you can avoid these boundaries being broken in the first place. Looking at the two main areas, you should focus on helpfulness since that is a major goal for volunteers. Think about the volunteer role. How is the role helpful? Why was the role designed the way it was? What purpose do the boundaries serve? Remember your risk analysis to determine the boundaries. Make sure these boundaries will still allow volunteers to actually be useful and helpful in their roles. Maybe the way the role was designed doesn't lend itself to helpfulness. Also, think about how ignoring the boundary is unhelpful, and how you might communicate this. What are the negative effects for the client and the organization? Along with increasing helpfulness, you should also work on decreasing helplessness. Remember that boundaries might be broken because volunteers feel they want to do more, or see a need they want to fulfill. Get an idea from your volunteers what issues seem to arise often, or what needs are going unmet in your organization or program. For certain violations, you or your volunteers can refer your clients elsewhere to meet specific needs, such as a client looking for a specific service that your organization cannot offer, especially through volunteers. You should also work with your volunteers to prepare them to say no to client requests. As much as they want to be helpful, some requests can be especially challenging and may break more rules than boundaries. A major part of decreasing helplessness is also making sure volunteers know who to approach and talk to for advice. When volunteers feel helpless, they may not know who they can talk to in your organization to help them through this feeling, or to give them advice on how to deal with the situation.